April 26, 1940, 6:15 in the morning. Marcus Schiller stood alone in the drafting room of North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California. The room was cold. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed. Before him, a drafting table. Blank, white paper stretched across its surface. A mechanical pencil sat to the right, a T-square to the left. Nothing else. Schiller was 40 years old, German-born. 5'9", wire-rimmed glasses, thinning dark hair combed straight back, calloused hands from 15 years of aircraft work, a slight accent that marked him as foreign in a country growing increasingly suspicious of foreigners. He had exactly 120 days to design a complete fighter aircraft from scratch. 120 days to do what normally took 2, sometimes 3 years. 120 days to prove that a German immigrant could serve American freedom better than German fascism. 120 days to save his company, possibly the British Empire, and definitely his career. The telephone on the wall behind him had rung 30 minutes earlier. The British Purchasing Commission, desperate. The Royal Air Force was hemorrhaging fighter planes over France. They needed more, hundreds more, thousands more. They'd asked North American to build the P-40 Warhawk under license, a proven design already in production. But the company president had gambled instead. "We can build you something better, in the same time." The British, desperate enough to believe anything, had agreed. The contract was signed, the deposit wired. And now Marcus Schiller, chief designer, stood before a blank page with 4 months to deliver a miracle. He placed his right hand flat on the paper, felt the texture, cool, smooth, empty. Outside, through the tall factory windows, the California sun was beginning to rise. Orange light crept across the concrete floor. The plant would come alive in 45 minutes. 300 workers, 30 engineers, all of them waiting to see what Schiller would create. He picked up the pencil. His hand did not shake. He had left Germany in 1925, 15 years ago, watching his homeland slide towards something dark, something that valued brutality over engineering, power over precision. He'd sworn then that his work would serve life, not death, freedom, not tyranny. Now, in this cold room, with blank paper and 120 days, he would prove it. Schiller drew the first line. The British were drowning. France was collapsing. The Wehrmacht had punched through the Ardennes. Panzer divisions were racing toward the Channel. The Royal Air Force was losing fighters faster than they could replace them. Hurricanes, Spitfires, shot down over Belgium, over France, over their own fields in southern England. The mathematics were brutal. Every combat sortie lost aircraft, battle damage, engine failure, pilot error, combat attrition. The RAF had perhaps 600 frontline fighters. They needed 3,000. American aircraft production was their only hope, but America wasn't at war. American factories were building for peacetime profits, not survival. Getting them to retool, to prioritize, to deliver required cash. Contracts, commitments. The British Purchasing Commission had come to California with one objective: more fighters, now, any way possible. North American Aviation was a small company, respected, capable, but not a major player. They'd built trainers, a few attack aircraft, nothing that matched the performance of frontline European fighters. When the British asked them to produce P-40 Warhawks under license from Curtiss-Wright, it made sense. The P-40 was already in production. The tooling existed. The blueprints were available. But North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, had seen an opportunity. "Give us the contract. We'll design something better, from scratch, in 120 days." It was an audacious claim, bordering on insane. Aircraft design was iterative, careful, years of testing, refinement, modification, wind tunnels, stress analysis, prototype failures, redesigns. 120 days was impossible, unless you were desperate enough to try, and unless you had Marcus Schiller. Schiller had assembled his team by noon that same day, 30 engineers, not the biggest design group, not the most experienced, but hungry, capable, willing to work every hour God gave them, and then some. He called them into the drafting room. They stood in a semicircle around the table, where that morning there had been nothing. Now there were sketches, rough, preliminary, but a vision was emerging. "Gentlemen," Schiller said. His voice was quiet, calm. The accent made every word deliberate. "The British need a fighter that can operate at high altitude, that can escort their bombers, that can outfight the Messerschmitt 109. We have 4 months to design it, 6 months to build the prototype, or this company closes, and we're all looking for work." He let that sink in. "We cannot design by committee. We cannot second guess. I will make the critical decisions. You will execute them. Fast, precisely, without argument. When we finish, every one of you will have built something no one believed possible." One of the younger engineers raised his hand. "Mr. Schiller, 4 months for complete design. How?" Schiller looked at him. "By making 3 decisions right now that would normally take 3 months each. And by accepting that good enough, delivered on time, beats perfect, delivered late." He turned to the sketches on the table. Decision 1. The wing. He pointed to a cross-section drawing. The wing profile was unusual, thinner than conventional designs, smoother. The upper and lower surfaces met at a sharp leading edge, then curved back in an almost sensual line. Laminar flow airfoil maintains smooth airflow over a greater percentage of the wing surface, reduces drag by 20% compared to conventional wings. One of the senior engineers frowned. "That's unproven. The wind tunnel data." "The wind tunnel data is promising," Schiller interrupted. "Not perfect, not guaranteed, but promising. We don't have time to perfect it. We make it work." He moved to the next sketch. Decision 2. Radiator placement. In conventional fighters, the radiator sat under the nose or in the wings. It created drag. Necessary drag, but drag nonetheless. Cooling the engine meant accepting that penalty. Schiller's sketch showed the radiator behind the pilot, below the fuselage, an unusual location. "We use the Meredith effect. The radiator intake is a carefully shaped duct. As air flows through, it heats up. Hot air expands, accelerates, exits the duct at higher velocity than it entered. The result? Instead of pure drag, we get a small amount of thrust. We turn a liability into an asset." The room was silent. Half the engineers were skeptical. The other half were intrigued. Decision 3. Philosophy. Schiller stepped back from the table, looked at each man. "German engineering, my training, values perfection, tight tolerances, complex systems, beautiful machinery. But perfection takes time. Perfection is expensive. Perfection is fragile. American production values volume, reliability, things that work well enough, in enough quantity, delivered on time. We will design this aircraft to American standards, not German standards. Parts that can be manufactured quickly, tolerances that allow for production variation, systems that mechanics in the field can repair with common tools." He paused. "I came to America to escape perfectionism that became fascism. Here, I will build something good enough to win a war. That is better than perfect." The engineers understood. This wasn't just a design project. This was Schiller's answer to everything he'd left behind in Germany. "We start now," he said. 16-hour days, 7 days a week, no one goes home until she's finished." They didn't go home. The next 90 days were a controlled frenzy. Schiller worked at the center drafting table. Around him, the team radiated outward. Wings, fuselage, tail, engine mounts, cooling systems, landing gear, armament, control surfaces, fuel systems, hydraulics, electrical. Every component had to be designed, calculated, drawn, and specified. The laminar wing was the gamble. Schiller spent 3 nights in the wind tunnel facility at Caltech, watching smoke streams flow over wooden models, measuring pressure gradients. The data confirmed his intuition. Smooth flow extended back 70% of the chord. Conventional wings lost it at 30%. The drag reduction was real. But would it work at full scale? Under combat conditions? With imperfect manufacturing? No time to find out gradually. They committed. Full laminar flow wing. If it failed, the entire aircraft failed. The radiator placement required intricate calculations. Duct shape, inlet angle, expansion ratio, Exit velocity. Get it wrong, and the engine would overheat, or the drag would be worse than conventional placement. Schiller spent a week refining the geometry, by hand, slide rule, graph paper. No computers, no simulation software, just mathematics and intuition earned over 15 years of aircraft design. One evening, 70 days into the project, one of the younger engineers found him asleep at his drafting table, head down on a stack of stress calculations, the pencil still in his hand. The engineer draped a jacket over his shoulders and left him there. Schiller woke at 3 in the morning, looked at the calculations, found an error in the third page, fixed it, kept working. By day 90, they had complete drawings. Every component, every dimension, every specification, thousands of pages, enough information to build the prototype. The factory floor took over. 300 workers, machinists, sheet metal fabricators, welders, assemblers, electricians. The prototype, designated NA-73X, began to take shape. Aluminum sheets cut to pattern, formed over wooden bucks, riveted into place. The fuselage emerged first, sleek, narrow, every line refined for minimum drag. No bulges, no excrescences, even the canopy was fed smoothly into the fuselage spine. The wings came next, built around a main spar strong enough to handle combat loads. The laminar airfoil shape had to be precise. Too much variation and the smooth flow would separate. Turbulence would kill the advantage. The workers fabricated jigs, checked every rib, every skin panel, held tolerances tighter than they'd ever held before. Schiller walked the factory floor every day, inspecting, questioning, approving, sometimes rejecting. A wing panel with a dent, rejected, start over. A weld with a flaw, rejected, cut it out, do it again. This airplane will be flown by a young man who wants to live, he told a welder who complained about the rework. Your weld is the difference between him coming home and his mother getting a telegram. Which do you prefer? The welder didn't complain again. Day 100 arrived. The aircraft was 70% complete. Fuselage assembled, wings attached, tail surfaces fitted, engine, an Allison V1710, the only high-power engine available in quantity, was mounted. Cooling system plumbed, control surfaces rigged. Day 110, 90%. Electrical system wired, fuel system tested, hydraulics functional, propeller installed. Day 115, final assembly, canopy fitted, armament bays prepared, final paint, bare metal, polished to a mirror finish. No camouflage, no markings yet, just raw aluminum gleaming under the factory lights. Day 117, 3 days early. The NA-73X was complete. Schiller stood in front of it at 6 in the morning. The factory was quiet. The day shift hadn't arrived yet. Just him and the aircraft. She was beautiful, not because she was ornate, not because she was complex, but because every line had purpose. Every curve reduced drag. Every component served the mission. Form followed function so perfectly that the result was grace. 40 feet long, 37-foot wingspan, sleek nose housing the Allison engine, delicate landing gear tucked under the wings. The tail stood high. The whole aircraft seemed poised, ready to leap into the air. Schiller walked around her slowly, ran his hand along the wing's leading edge, felt the smoothness of the laminar surface. Perfect. The workers had held tolerance. The airfoil shape was exact. He moved to the radiator intake, crouched down, looked through the duct. The radiator core sat precisely positioned. The exit duct flared exactly as calculated. If the math was right, this would work. If. He stood. Placed both hands flat on the fuselage side. The metal was cool, smooth, rivets flush, seams tight. This was a machine built by human hands. 300 workers, 90 days of labor, millions of decisions, thousands of parts, all of it coming together into this single object. Behind him, the factory doors opened. The day shift was arriving. Within an hour, they'd roll the NA-73X out to the flight line. Within a week, A test pilot would fly her for the first time. Schiller had done his part. The design was sound. The construction was solid. Now came the test. Either she would fly as calculated, or the math was wrong, or the assumptions were flawed, or some detail, some minor thing overlooked, would kill the pilot and destroy 4 months of work. Aircraft design was always a gamble. You calculated, you tested, you refined. But in the end, you strapped a man into a machine and sent him into the sky and hoped your mathematics were stronger than gravity. Schiller was confident in his mathematics, but not certain, never certain. October 26, 1940. 183 days after Schiller had drawn that first line. 63 days ahead of the British contract deadline. The NA-73X sat on the tarmac at Mines Field. Test pilot Vance Breeze walked around her, checking control surfaces, looking for hydraulic leaks, examining the landing gear, standard pre-flight. Schiller stood with the engineering team 50 yards away, watching. The morning was cool, clear sky, light wind, perfect conditions for a first flight. Breeze was one of the best, calm, analytical. If something went wrong, he'd either fix it or bring the aircraft back safely. Probably. Schiller's hands were in his coat pockets. His right hand was clenched into a fist. No one could see it, but he could feel his nails digging into his palm. 4 months of work. A company's future. A contribution to a war that would determine whether fascism or freedom prevailed. All of it sitting on that tarmac, about to either prove Schiller right or prove him a fool. Breeze climbed into the cockpit, settled into the seat, pulled the canopy closed. The Allison engine coughed, caught, roared to life. The propeller spun into a blur. Blue smoke puffed from the exhaust stacks. She sounded good. Breeze ran through his checks. Instruments, controls, engine parameters, oil pressure, coolant temperature. Everything nominal. He released the brakes. The NA-73X rolled forward. Picking up speed, tail came up. The aircraft was balanced on the main gear now. 40 miles per hour, 50, 60. And then she lifted. Smooth. No bounce, no hesitation. The landing gear retracted with a solid thunk. Breeze climbed away from the field. 1,000 feet, 2,000. Banking left in a gentle turn. Schiller exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The aircraft flew. That was the first hurdle. Now came the real test. Performance, handling, stability, speed. Breeze spent 40 minutes in the air, exploring the flight envelope. Slow flight, accelerated stalls, turns, climbs, dives, landing gear extension and retraction, flaps. Everything a pilot would do in combat. When he landed, taxied back and shut down the engine, the engineering team converged on the aircraft. Breeze climbed out, took off his leather helmet, looked at Schiller. "Well?" Schiller asked. Breeze smiled. "She's responsive, balanced, no bad habits, climbs well, turns well, fast too, feels fast, very fast. Problems? Visibility could be better. The canopy framing blocks some sight lines, but overall..." Breeze paused. "Overall, Mr. Schiller, you built a damn fine airplane." Relief washed through Schiller. Not triumph. Not yet. But relief. The design worked. The gamble on the laminar wing had paid off. The Meredith effect radiator functioned as calculated. The aircraft was stable, controllable, and apparently fast. The test data came back that evening. Maximum speed at 10,000 feet, 382 miles per hour. Faster than the P-40, faster than the Hurricane, almost as fast as the Spitfire, at 10,000 feet. But what about 25,000 feet? What happened when the Allison engine ran out of breath in the thin air? That test would come later, after more flights, after the British acceptance trials. For now, Schiller allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. 4 months ago, he'd stared at a blank page. Today, he'd watched that blank page fly. The altitude tests came 6 weeks later. December 1940. Wright Field, Ohio. United States Army Air Force testing facility. Cold, gray sky, wind cutting across the tarmac. The Mustang sat among other aircraft under evaluation. Sleek, beautiful, out of place among the utilitarian fighters the Army preferred. A USAF test pilot, Captain Robert Elder, climbed into the cockpit. Same pre-flight routine Vance Breeze had performed in California. But this time, the test card called for high-altitude performance evaluation, combat ceiling, rate of climb, speed at 25,000 feet. The numbers that would determine whether this aircraft could fight where the war was actually being fought. Schiller wasn't there. He was back in California, but he knew what was happening. He'd run the calculations himself. The Allison V1710 engine produced 1,150 horsepower at sea level, good power, but without a two-stage supercharger, that power bled away as the air thinned. At 15,000 feet, the engine was producing maybe 900 horsepower. At 20,000 feet, 700. At 25,000 feet, 500. You couldn't fight at 25,000 feet with 500 horsepower. Not against Messerschmitt 109Es with 1,200 horsepower at altitude. Not against Focke-Wulf 190Es that could climb and dive and turn at heights where the Mustang would be gasping. The telegram arrived 3 days later. Schiller opened it in his office, read it once, read it again. The words didn't change. Altitude performance inadequate, stop. Maximum combat ceiling 21,000 feet, stop. Speed, at 25,000 feet, significantly degraded, stop. Aircraft not recommended for high-altitude combat operations, stop. Not recommended. 4 months of work. 117 days from blank paper to flying prototype. The most aerodynamically refined fighter aircraft anyone had built, and it was inadequate. Schiller sat down, placed the telegram on his desk, stared at it. The airframe was perfect, every line, every curve, every surface optimized for minimum drag. The laminar wing worked exactly as calculated. The Meredith effect radiator turned drag into thrust. The structure was strong. The handling was beautiful. But the heart was wrong. The Allison engine, the only engine available, the engine the British had specified because nothing else could be delivered in quantity, couldn't perform where it mattered most. Schiller had built a racehorse, but the race was being run at an altitude where his horse couldn't breathe. He thought about the young pilots who would fly this aircraft, thought about them trying to climb to 25,000 feet to intercept German bombers, watching the altimeter creep upward, feeling the controls get mushy as the thin air robbed the wings of bite, seeing the enemy fighters above them, faster, more powerful, untouchable. Those pilots would die, and it would be his fault, not because the design was flawed, but because the design was incomplete, a masterpiece without the strength to fulfill its purpose. Marcus Schiller, who had left Germany to build something that mattered, had instead built something beautiful and useless. He stayed in his office until midnight, alone, the factory floor dark and silent below. The official rejection came in January 1941, a letter from the Army Air Force Materiel Division, formal, bureaucratic, cold. The Mustang did not meet requirements for a frontline fighter aircraft. Altitude performance was insufficient for European theater operations. While the airframe showed promise, the current power plant configuration rendered it unsuitable for primary combat missions. The Army would not be placing orders beyond a small number for evaluation purposes. Thank you for your submission. The British were more generous. They'd already ordered the aircraft, already committed. They took delivery and put the Mustangs to work. But not as fighters, as reconnaissance aircraft, tactical support, low-level ground attack, missions that kept them below 15,000 feet where the Allison still had power. Schiller read the mission reports. His aircraft, designed to dominate the sky, was taking photographs, strafing trucks, running messages, important work, necessary work, but not what she was meant to do. The months that followed were dark. Schiller continued working, designing trainers, improving existing aircraft, the routine work that kept an aerospace company running. but the Mustang haunted him. Every evening when he left the factory, he walked past the production line where they were building Mustangs for the British, sleek fighters rolling off the assembly line, each one beautiful, each one handicapped. By the spring of 1942, 18 months had passed since that first flight. 18 months since he'd watched the NA-73X lift off and felt pride in what he'd created. That pride had curdled into something bitter. He stopped reading the mission reports, stopped following the Mustang's operational use. It was easier not to know, easier to focus on other projects, easier to pretend that his masterpiece hadn't become a footnote. Then, in April 1942, the telephone in his office rang. It was 4 in the afternoon. Schiller was reviewing drawings for a training aircraft. Tedious work. Safe work. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. Marcus Schiller. "Mr. Schiller, my name is Reginald Harwell. I'm calling from England, from Rolls-Royce." British accent. Educated. Precise. "How can I help you, Mr. Harwell?" "I've seen your aircraft, the Mustang. 5 of them are here for evaluation. I've examined them quite thoroughly." Schiller said nothing, waited. "Mr. Schiller, I believe you've built the finest airframe I've ever seen. The aerodynamics are extraordinary. The attention to detail is remarkable. But the engine is wrong." "I'm aware," Schiller said. His voice was flat. "The Allison was specified by the contract. It's what we had available." "Yes, but it doesn't have to stay that way." Schiller sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Harwell said, "that we should put a Merlin engine in your airframe." Silence on the line. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the engine that powered the Spitfire, 12 cylinders, 2-stage supercharger, 1,700 horsepower, and more importantly, power that didn't fade at altitude. At 25,000 feet, the Merlin was still producing 85% of its sea-level power. It was the engine Schiller had wanted from the beginning, the engine that didn't exist in American production, the engine that could turn his beautiful, useless airframe into something that could actually fight. "Mr. Harwell," Schiller said slowly, "you can't just swap engines. Different mounting points, different cooling requirements, different weight distribution. The center of gravity would shift. The aircraft might be unflyable." "I'm aware of the challenges," Harwell replied. "I'm an engineer, Mr. Schiller, same as you, and I'm telling you it can be done. Should be done. Your airframe deserves the right engine." Schiller closed his eyes. 18 months of disappointment. 18 months of watching his creation relegated to secondary missions. And now this British engineer was suggesting the impossible. "If you destroy my airframe, trying to force a different engine into it—" "I won't destroy it," Harwell interrupted. "I'll complete it. Trust me, Mr. Schiller. Engineer to engineer. I know what I'm doing." Schiller thought about it, calculated rapidly. The Merlin was physically larger than the Allison, heavier. The mounting points would have to be completely redesigned, the cooling system reconfigured. The nose section might need to be lengthened. The weight shift would move the center of gravity forward, which could make the aircraft nose-heavy, unstable, impossible to trim properly. It was a massive undertaking, months of work. And if it failed, it would prove that the Mustang was fundamentally flawed, not just poorly powered, but incompatible with the engine it needed. "How many aircraft?" Schiller asked. "We have 4 we can modify. If it works, we'll convert more. And if it doesn't work, then we'll have learned something. But Mr. Schiller, I don't believe it will fail. I've run the calculations. The Merlin will fit. The weight distribution is manageable. Your airframe is strong enough. This will work." Schiller made his decision. "I'll send you the structural drawings, everything you need, the stress calculations, the load paths. But Mr. Harwell, if you're going to do this, do it right. No shortcuts, no compromises." "Wouldn't dream of it," Harwell said. The next 6 months were agony. Schiller wasn't in England, couldn't be. Travel across the Atlantic in 1942 was dangerous. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes. Aircraft were needed for military transport. A civilian engineer trying to cross the ocean to work on an experimental project wasn't a priority. So Schiller worked by telegram, by telephone when connections were available, by mail when they weren't. Harwell's team in England disassembled one of the Mustangs, removed the Allison engine, began fabricating new mounting points for the Merlin. The front fuselage section had to be modified, new engine bearers, new cooling system plumbing. The radiator ducting remained. Schiller's Meredith effect design was sound, but it had to be recalibrated for the Merlin's different heat output. Every week, Harwell sent progress reports, detailed, technical, the kind of communication one engineer sends another when they both understand that precision matters more than encouragement. Engine mounts fabricated. Weight is 17 pounds heavier than estimated, compensating with ballast in tail section. Cooling system routing complete, tested at ground idle, temperatures nominal. Propeller adapter machined, Rolls-Royce 4-blade propeller installed, heavier than Allison 3-blade. Additional weight forward, recalculating center of gravity. Schiller read each telegram, ran his own calculations, cross-checked Harwell's numbers. The center of gravity was shifting forward. That was dangerous. Too much weight in the nose, and the aircraft would be unstable in pitch, difficult to control. A young pilot in combat wouldn't have the strength or the skill to handle it. He sent a telegram back. Center of gravity critical, stop. Consider moving battery aft, stop. Relocate radio equipment, stop. Every pound matters, stop. Harwell's response came 2 days later. Battery relocated, stop. Radio aft of cockpit, stop. CG. Now 0.3 inches forward of original, stop. Within acceptable limits, stop. 0.3 inches, 7.5 millimeters. The difference between flyable and unflyable might come down to less than a centimeter. This was what engineering was. Not grand visions, not sweeping designs, but millimeters, grams, tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, getting 10,000 details right so that one young man in a cockpit could do his job and come home alive. Schiller barely slept during those months. He'd wake at 3 in the morning thinking about stress loads, wing attachment points, whether the additional power of the Merlin would exceed the structural limits of the airframe, whether some detail he'd overlooked 18 months ago would surface now and destroy everything. In late September, a telegram arrived. Conversion complete. Stop. Aircraft designated Mustang X. Stop. First flight scheduled 13th October. Stop. October 13th, 1942. Almost exactly 2 years after that first flight of the NA-73X in California, Schiller arranged to be by the telephone in his office at the time of the test flight. The time difference meant it would be afternoon in England, morning in California. He told his secretary to hold all calls, locked his office door, sat at his desk, waiting. The phone rang at 9:47 in the morning. He grabbed it before the second ring. Schiller? Mr. Schiller. Reginald Harwell. She flew. Schiller's hand tightened on the receiver. And she's magnificent. The test pilot, Captain Drake, he's been flying Spitfires for 2 years. He says this is better, faster, climbs like she's got wings made of light. At 20,000 feet, where your Allison version would start to slow down, the Merlin is just getting started. We hit 25,000 feet and she was still accelerating. Schiller closed his eyes, felt something in his chest unclench, something that had been tight for 18 months. Handling? He asked. Better than the original. The weight distribution actually improved the balance. She's lighter on the controls, more responsive. Drake says it's the best fighter he's ever flown. Speed? We're still collecting data, but preliminary numbers show 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Your Allison version did 390 at 10,000 and then bled off. This maintains speed at altitude, actually gets faster as she climbs. 440 miles per hour, faster than a Messerschmitt 109, faster than a Focke-Wulf 190, faster than anything the Germans had, and she could maintain that speed at the altitude where the air war was being fought. Mr. Harwell, Schiller said quietly. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schiller. You built the airframe. I just gave it the heart it deserved. This aircraft is going to change the war. When Schiller hung up, he He sat in his office for a long time. Just sat, looking at the drawings on his wall. The Mustang, his aircraft, the design that had disappointed him, that had been relegated to second-tier missions, that he'd tried to forget. She'd been right all along. The airframe had been right. The aerodynamics had been right. The structure had been right. She'd just been waiting for the right heart. Marcus Schiller, who had left Germany to prove that engineering could serve freedom, had built an aircraft that might actually do it, if the Americans would listen. They didn't listen. News of the Mustang X reached the United States Army Air Force in November 1942. The test data was transmitted, the performance reports, the enthusiastic endorsements from British test pilots. The response from Washington was skeptical. The Mustang had been evaluated and rejected. The Army had moved on. They were building P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, aircraft that worked, aircraft in production. Changing course now, admitting that a simple engine swap would create a world-class fighter, would be embarrassing. Besides, the British always exaggerated. Everyone knew that. Schiller received calls from Army procurement officers, polite, dismissive. "We're aware of the British tests. We'll review the data. Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Translation: "We're not interested." It was infuriating. The aircraft he'd designed, that had been rejected by American brass, was being vindicated by British engineering, and the Americans were too proud to admit they'd been wrong. He tried going through channels, wrote reports, submitted data, requested that the Army test a Merlin-powered Mustang themselves. The requests were acknowledged, then filed, then forgotten. The months passed. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer. 1943 arrived. American bombers were flying deep into Germany, daylight raids, hitting factories, rail yards, ball-bearing plants, strategic targets that could cripple the German war machine. But the bombers were unescorted. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings that flew with them had the range to get to Western Germany. Maybe, if everything went perfectly, if the winds were favorable, if they didn't have to dogfight on the way. But they couldn't reach Berlin, couldn't escort bombers deep into the heart of German territory. The escorts had to turn back, and then the bombers were alone, vulnerable. German fighters swarmed them. The losses were catastrophic. Schiller read the casualty reports: bomber crews missing, shot down over Germany, captured, killed. Every one of those crews could have been protected by Mustangs with Merlin engines, aircraft with the range to go the distance, the speed to outfight German interceptors, the performance to dominate the sky. But American pride stood in the way. Then came October 14th, 1943. The target was Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. Ball-bearing factories, critical to German war production. If they could be destroyed, it would cripple tank production, aircraft production, everything that relied on precision bearings. 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from England that morning, the largest daylight raid yet. P-47 Thunderbolts escorted them part way. Then, over Belgium, the escorts turned back. Fuel running low, range exhausted. The B-17s continued alone. What happened next was massacre. German fighters rose to meet them. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, hundreds of them. Without American escorts, the German pilots could attack with impunity. They positioned themselves ahead of the bomber formations, made head-on passes, raked the bombers with cannon fire. B-17s burned, fell, exploded. 60 bombers went down, 600 airmen killed or captured in a single day. The ones who made it back told stories of watching their wingmen disintegrate, of flying through debris fields, of seeing parachutes blossom, and knowing those men were going to spend the rest of the war in prison camps, if they were lucky. The bombing campaign was on the brink of collapse. The losses were unsustainable. The crews were reaching their breaking points. You can only watch your friends die so many times before you stop believing you'll survive. The reports reached Washington, the casualty lists, the photographs of burned aircraft, the testimony from surviving crew members, and finally, reluctantly, the Army Air Force admitted what should have been obvious 18 months earlier. They needed the Mustang. The orders came through in December 1943, 2,000 P-51B Mustangs, with Packard-built Merlin engines, American production, American pilots. The full weight of American industrial might finally committed to building the aircraft Schiller had designed 3 years earlier. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt rage. Rage at the 18 months wasted. Rage at the bureaucratic pride that had delayed the decision. Rage at the bomber crews who had died because the right aircraft wasn't available. Rage at himself for not fighting harder, for not forcing the issue, for accepting the rejection and moving on, instead of screaming that his airframe was right and only the engine was wrong. But rage doesn't build aircraft. Precision does. Focus does. Work does. And there was work to be done. Because the Packard-built Merlin engines, when they started coming off the production line, had problems. The quality wasn't there. Rolls-Royce in England had spent decades refining the Merlin. Tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Assembly procedures that required skilled craftsmen. Quality control that rejected anything less than perfect. Packard in Detroit was building car engines. They understood volume production, interchangeable parts, assembly line efficiency. But they didn't understand that an aircraft engine turning at 3,000 RPM at 25,000 feet had different requirements than a Packard straight 8 in a luxury sedan. The early Packard Merlins were failing. Oil leaks, bearing failures, valve problems, overheating. Test pilots reported engine failures on acceptance flights. Factory workers found defects during assembly. The rejection rate was hitting 40%. 2,000 Mustangs on order, and the engines were failing. Schiller got a call in January 1944. The Army wanted him at the Packard plant, Detroit. Immediately, fix the problem. He flew out the next day. The Packard plant was enormous. Acres of factory floor, thousands of workers, assembly lines producing engines by the hundreds. The scale was impressive. The quality was not. Schiller spent 3 days on the floor, watching assembly, inspecting engines, talking to workers. He found the problems. Tolerances were too loose. Packard was building to automotive standards. Close enough for a car engine, not close enough for an aircraft engine that had to run for hundreds of hours under combat stress. Assembly procedures were inconsistent. One shift would torque fasteners to spec. Another shift would do it by feel. The variation meant some engines were solid, others were ticking time bombs. Quality control was overwhelmed. Inspectors couldn't keep up with the production rate. Defective components were slipping through. Schiller called a meeting with Packard's chief engineer, a man named Victor Stone, gruff, practical, Detroit through and through. "Mr. Stone," Schiller said, "your workers are building car engines. I need them to build aircraft engines." Stone bristled. "We're following the specifications Rolls-Royce provided." "You're following them approximately," Schiller corrected. "Aircraft engines require precision. A car engine that's slightly out of spec will run rough. An aircraft engine that's slightly out of spec will fail at 25,000 feet and kill the pilot." Stone stared at him. "What do you want me to do? Slow down production? We've got quotas to meet." "I want you to meet the quotas with engines that work. That means tighter quality control. That means training your workers. That means rejecting anything that doesn't meet spec, even if it looks close enough. That'll cost money. Losing pilots costs more." Stone thought about it. He was a practical man, understood systems, understood that building things right the first time was cheaper than rebuilding them later. "All right," he said, "show me what needs to change." Schiller spent the next 6 weeks in Detroit, on the factory floor, training workers, demonstrating proper torque procedures, explaining why tolerances mattered, rejecting engines that didn't meet spec, and making the workers rebuild them until they got it right. The workers complained. The rejection rate climbed even higher initially. Foreman worried about missing quotas. But Schiller was relentless. "This rivet," he said, holding up a single piece of metal, "goes into the engine mount. If it's installed wrong, if the hole is drilled off-center by 2,000ths of an inch, it will work loose under vibration. The engine will shift. The propeller will be out of balance. The aircraft will vibrate itself apart. And the pilot will die. Do you want to be the man who drilled that hole wrong?" The workers stopped complaining. By March 1944, the rejection rate had dropped to 5%. The engines coming off the line were solid, reliable, up to Rolls-Royce standards. Production hit 1,000 engines per month, 1,000 Mustangs per month, enough to equip fighter groups across England, enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back, enough to change the war. Schiller returned to California in late March, exhausted. He'd been living in hotels for weeks, eating factory cafeteria food, breathing machine oil and aluminum dust. But the engines were right now. The aircraft were being built, and soon, very soon, they'd be in combat. In early April, he received word that the first P-51B Mustangs had arrived in England. Fighter groups were transitioning from P-47s. Pilots were flying their first missions. He got a letter from one of the pilots, a captain named Brooks, commander of the 4th Fighter Group. "Mr. Schiller, I flew your aircraft today. She's everything they said, fast, agile, and she'll take us all the way to Berlin. Thank you for building something that might actually bring us home." Marcus Schiller read that letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer, next to the telegram from December 1940 that had said his aircraft was inadequate. Both documents were true, both documents were lies. The aircraft had always been adequate, more than adequate. She'd just been waiting for someone to see it. March 6, 1944. Marcus Schiller sat in his office in Inglewood, California, 3,000 miles from England, 5,000 miles from Berlin, but closer to the war than he'd ever been. On his desk, a telephone, a notepad, a pencil. The clock on the wall read 11:43 in the morning, Pacific time, which meant 7:43 in the evening in England. The mission would be over by now, one way or another. 200 P-51B Mustangs had taken off from English airbases that morning. Their target? Berlin. 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses carrying bombs deep into the heart of Germany. And for the first time, those bombers would have fighter escort for the entire mission, all the way in, all the way out. Schiller's aircraft, his design, with Reginald Harwell's Merlin engine and Packard's improved production quality, finally doing what she'd been designed to do 4 years ago. He'd been waiting by the phone since 9 in the morning, drinking cold coffee, not eating, just waiting. The phone rang. He grabbed it before the first ring finished. "Schiller." "Mr. Schiller, this is Colonel Andrews, 8th Air Force Headquarters calling from England." American accent, southern, tired, but something else in the voice, something that might have been relief. "I thought you'd want to know. The mission is complete. The bombers are back." Schiller waited, said nothing. "Mr. Schiller, your Mustangs went all the way to Berlin, escorted the heavies over the target, fought off every German fighter that tried to intercept, and brought the bombers home." "Losses?" Schiller's voice was steady, but his hand on the phone was not. 11 Mustangs out of 200, 5%. The Germans lost 82 fighters confirmed, probably more. Schiller did the mathematics in his head. 82 German fighters destroyed, 11 Mustangs lost, 7.4 to 1 kill ratio. And the bombers? 24 lost, out of 800, 3% loss rate. 3%. Before the Mustangs, bomber losses on deep penetration raids ran 15, sometimes 20%. Schweinfurt had been 16%. 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men. 3% meant the bombing campaign was sustainable, meant crews had a chance of completing their tours, meant the strategic air war could continue. "Mr. Schiller, the pilots are calling it a slaughter, our slaughter. The Germans couldn't touch us. Every time they tried to get to the bombers, the Mustangs were there, faster, higher. The Krauts couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't fight, they just died." Schiller closed his eyes. 4 years ago, he'd drawn a line on blank paper. 120 days of work, 18 months of disappointment, 6 months of hoping someone else could fix what he couldn't. And now, over Berlin, young Americans were dominating the sky in aircraft he designed. "The pilots want me to tell you something," Colonel Andrews said. "They said your airplane saved their lives today, said she's the best fighter anyone's ever flown, said to tell you thank you." Schiller's throat was tight. "Tell them I just drew the lines. They're the ones flying her." "They're flying her well, Mr. Schiller. Real well. This is going to change everything." The call ended. Schiller sat in his office, alone. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating the drawings on his walls. Mustang schematics, airfoil sections, stress calculations. He thought about the 19-year-old boy from Stuttgart who'd decided to become an engineer, who'd loved aircraft before he understood what they'd be used for, who'd left Germany in 1925 because he'd seen something dark growing in his homeland. That boy had wanted to build things that mattered, things that helped, things that proved engineering could serve life instead of death. Marcus Schiller, 44 years old, sitting in a California office, had finally done it. The reports came in over the following weeks. March 8, 1944. Another Berlin mission. Similar results. German fighters destroyed. Bombers protected. The Mustangs were everywhere. Pilots reported that German fighters were becoming reluctant to engage. They'd climb to attack the bombers, see the Mustangs, and dive away. Survival over aggression. March 15, 1944. A German pilot, shot down and captured, was interrogated. The transcript reached Schiller 2 weeks later. Question: what is your assessment of the American P-51? Answer: when we saw Thunderbolts, we knew they had limited range. We could wait them out. When we saw Lightnings, we knew their vulnerabilities and avoided those areas. But the Mustangs, they are everywhere, all the time. They are faster than our fighters, they climb better, they turn as well as we do, and they never run out of fuel. There is nowhere to hide from them. Question: can the Luftwaffe defeat them? Answer: no. One word. Number. Schiller read that transcript in his office, read it twice. The German pilot's assessment was clinical, professional, not bitter, not angry, just factual. The Mustang was better. The war in the air was lost. A week later, another document arrived. This one was stamped with German military classifications, captured from a downed aircraft. A technical assessment prepared by Messerschmitt engineers who'd examined a crashed Mustang. The report was in German. Schiller translated it himself. The P-51 represents a synthesis of superior American airframe design with superior British engine technology. The laminar flow wing achieves drag reduction we have been unable to match. The cooling system design is innovative and efficient. The engine installation provides high-altitude performance exceeding our current capabilities. Combined with American mass production capacity, this aircraft presents a threat we are unable to counter with available resources. Conclusion. Recommend focus on defensive tactics. Offensive air superiority is no longer achievable. Schiller read that last line 3 times. Offensive air superiority is no longer achievable. The engineers who'd built the Messerschmitt 109, who designed the Focke-Wulf 190, German engineers from the country that had considered itself the pinnacle of technical excellence, were admitting they couldn't compete with an American aircraft, with his aircraft. Marcus Schiller, the German immigrant who'd left his homeland to escape what it was becoming, had built the weapon that proved American engineering could defeat German engineering. Not because Americans were smarter, but because the system was different, the philosophy was different. Schiller had learned to design for production, for maintainability, for good enough instead of perfect, for abundance instead of scarcity. German engineers still designed for perfection, for tight tolerances, for craftsmanship that required skilled labor and rare materials. Beautiful aircraft, sophisticated aircraft, but not enough of them, and not soon enough. The Mustang wasn't perfect, it was merely excellent, and there were thousands of them. That was enough. By the summer of 1944, the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. American bombers flew daily missions deep into Germany, hitting oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, aircraft factories, railway yards, every strategic target that kept the German war machine running. And they flew with Mustang escorts, always. The bomber loss rate stayed at 3 to 4%, sustainable. The crews believed they might survive their tours. Morale improved. Effectiveness improved. German fighter losses accelerated. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. Fuel shortages meant new pilots got minimal training, 50 hours, sometimes less. They went into combat against American pilots with 200, 300 hours of training, flying inferior aircraft against superior numbers. The outcome was predictable. Schiller tracked the statistics. 15,000 P-51 Mustangs were built by war's end. Production peaked at over 1,000 per month. The factories ran 3 shifts. Workers who'd never built aircraft before were assembling Mustangs with precision because Schiller had designed them to be buildable. Germany produced perhaps 7,000 fighters total in the same period. Good fighters, sophisticated fighters, but 7,000 against 15,000 is mathematics, not courage. 2,500 Mustangs were lost in combat, 17% of production. Every loss meant a pilot killed, captured, or wounded. Every loss was a young man who climbed into an aircraft Schiller designed and didn't come home. He thought about them, all of them, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't. But he also thought about the bomber crews, 10 men per bomber. The Mustangs had reduced bomber losses from 16% to 3%, 13% difference. On 800 aircraft per mission, that was 100 bombers saved per mission, 1,000 men per mission, over hundreds of missions. The mathematics were brutal and clear. The Mustang had saved more lives than it cost. That was what engineering was supposed to do. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Schiller was in his office when the announcement came over the radio. Germany had surrendered, unconditional. The fighting was over. He turned off the radio, sat in silence. The country he'd been born in had been defeated. By the country he'd chosen, using weapons he'd helped create. He should have felt something. Triumph, vindication, relief. Instead, he felt tired. 60 million people dead, cities destroyed, nations shattered. And for what? Because some men decided their race was superior, their nation was destined to rule. Their system was the only system. Engineering had fed that machine. German engineering. Brilliant, sophisticated, deadly engineering. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, rockets. All of it designed by men who were good at mathematics and didn't ask enough questions about what they were building. Schiller had asked those questions, had left, had chosen differently, but he knew, sitting in his office that May afternoon, that the choice had been luck as much as virtue. He'd left Germany in 1925, before the worst. If he'd been younger, if he'd stayed, would he have had the courage to resist? Or would he have been like those engineers at Messerschmitt and Fokker-Wulf, building beautiful machines for terrible purposes and telling themselves they were just doing their jobs? He didn't know, hoped he would have resisted, couldn't be certain. What he knew was this: engineering without ethics was just mathematics in service of murder, and he'd spent 20 years trying to prove engineering could serve something better. In June 1945, Schiller made the trip he'd been unable to make during the war, crossed the Atlantic on a military transport, landed in England, travelled to an airbase in East Anglia where Mustangs were still stationed. The war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific continued. Some of the fighter groups were being redeployed, others were preparing to return home. Colonel Daniel Brooks, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, met him on the tarmac. Brooks was 31 years old, looked 50, 2 years of combat, 300 missions, 24 confirmed kills, and alive, which was more than could be said for a third of the pilots who'd started with him. They shook hands. Brooks led him to the flight line, where a dozen Mustangs were parked. "Mr. Schiller, I wanted you to see what your aircraft looks like after 2 years of combat." The Mustangs were worn, paint chipped, panel lines darkened with oil residue, propeller blades nicked from debris, canopy scratches from thousands of hours in the air, patches over bullet holes, evidence of hard use by young men who'd pushed these machines to their limits and beyond. But they were still flying, still functional, still bringing pilots home. "We've lost birds to combat," Brooks said. "German fighters, flak. But we haven't lost a single aircraft to structural failure, not one. "Your airframe is solid, Mr. Schiller. She takes punishment and keeps flying." They walked down the line. Brooks pointed to one Mustang with 57 kill markings painted on the fuselage. "That's mine. Flown her since February '44, taken hits from 20mm cannons, had hydraulics shot out over Hamburg, lost oil pressure over Berlin. Every time she brought me home. I owe my life to your aeroplane." Schiller reached out, touched the fuselage. The metal was warm from the afternoon sun, smooth despite the wear. He could feel the rivets under his palm, every one of them placed by a worker he'd trained, every panel formed to tolerances he'd specified. "You brought yourself home, Colonel," Schiller said. "She just helped." She helped a lot. They stood there, the German-born engineer and the American combat pilot, looking at an aircraft that had been rejected, then vindicated, then proven in the only test that mattered. "The pilots want to meet you," Brooks said, "if you're willing." Schiller met them in the ready room. 20 pilots, some barely old enough to drink, others looking older than their years. They stood when he entered. He told them to sit. They asked questions about the design, about the laminar wing, about whether he'd known it would be this good. "I knew the airframe was right," Schiller said. "I didn't know if anyone would see it. The engine was wrong for 2 years. I thought she'd be forgotten. But Mr. Harwell in England, he saw what she could be, and you proved it." One of the younger pilots, a lieutenant with 5 kills and a distinguished flying cross, asked, "Mr. Schiller, what's it feel like, knowing you designed the best fighter of the war?" Schiller thought about it, about the blank paper 4 years ago, about the rejection, about the 18 months of disappointment, about the bomber crews saved, about the 2,000 pilots who died flying his aircraft, about the 10,000 who'd survived because of it. "It feels like I got lucky," he said finally. "Lucky that I left Germany when I did. Lucky that the British were desperate enough to try something impossible. Lucky that American industry could build enough of them. The aircraft is good, but luck matters as much as engineering." The pilots didn't argue. They'd survived combat. They understood luck. Schiller returned to California, back to work. The war in the Pacific ended in August. Mustang production slowed, then stopped. The contracts were cancelled, the factories retooled for peacetime production. Marcus Schiller, 45 years old, moved on to other projects. Jet aircraft, the future. The Mustang was the past. But the past had a way of following him. The years passed. 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. Schiller watched the world change, watched aircraft evolve from propellers to jets to rockets, watched engineering principles he'd developed in that drafting room in 1940 influence generations of designers. The Mustang became legend, not just among pilots who'd flown her, but among anyone who cared about aircraft, about engineering, about what happens when desperation meets innovation. In 1975, Marcus Schiller was 75 years old. He'd outlived most of his contemporaries. The other engineers from that 4-month sprint in 1940, the test pilots, the factory workers. Time took them all eventually. But the Mustang endured. There were perhaps 200 still flying. Air shows, racing, museums, enthusiasts who loved the aircraft enough to spend fortunes keeping them airborne. Schiller attended an air show in Reno, sat in the stands, watched Mustangs fly racing patterns around pylons, pilots pushing them to limits even combat hadn't demanded. 450 miles per hour, 500, the airframes holding together despite stressors Schiller had never calculated for. A young man, maybe 25, sat next to him, watched the racing, eventually asked, "You an aviation fan?" "I used to design aircraft," Schiller said. His accent was still there, softer now. 50 years in America had smoothed it, but not erased it. "Anything I'd know?" "Maybe. The P-51 Mustang." The young man's eyes widened. "You designed the Mustang?" "The airframe, yes." "That's incredible. Best fighter of World War II. Everyone knows that." Schiller watched the Mustangs racing, heard the Merlins roaring, saw the crowd cheering. "Can I ask you something?" the young man said. What was it like, knowing you designed the best? Schiller had been asked that question many times over the years, by pilots, by engineers, by historians. He'd given different answers, all of them true, all of them incomplete. "I'll tell you what I learned," he said. "I came to America from Germany, left because I saw my country becoming something terrible. In Germany, we valued perfection, precision, engineering so exact, so refined, that it was beautiful. But perfection takes time, takes resources, takes expertise that's rare. And when you build for perfection, you build fewer, you build slower, you build things that can't be replaced when they're lost." The young man listened. The Mustangs howled past. The crowd roared. "In America, I learned a different way. Good enough, on time, in quantity. Not perfect, but available. Not irreplaceable, but abundant. The Mustang wasn't the most sophisticated fighter. German engineers could have built something more precise, more advanced. But they couldn't have built 15,000 of them. Couldn't have built them fast enough. Couldn't have made them simple enough that mechanics in muddy fields could keep them running." Schiller paused, watched a Mustang pull up into a climbing turn, the wing he'd designed. Still flying, still working. "So what was it like designing the best?" "I don't know. I designed something good enough at a time when good enough was exactly what was needed. That's better than perfect." The young man thought about that. "So you're saying it's not about being the best, it's about being right for the moment?" "I'm saying perfection is the enemy of enough, and enough is what wins wars. Enough is what saves lives. Enough is what matters when the choice is between beautiful and available." Down on the field, a Mustang crossed the finish line. Winner. The crowd cheered. The pilot brought the aircraft around for a victory lap. Low, fast, showing off what the airframe could still do 35 years after it was designed. Schiller stood up. His knees hurt. His back hurt. 75 years old and feeling every one of them. But the Mustang flying below, she wasn't old. She was timeless. Because the principles that made her work, efficiency, simplicity, abundance, those principles didn't age. That evening, he sat in his study, looked at the drawings on his walls, Mustang schematics, airfoil sections, stress diagrams, a lifetime of work reduced to lines on paper. He thought about the young man's question. What was it like knowing you'd designed the best? The answer was, he hadn't designed the best. He'd designed good enough, and he'd learned to let go of perfect, to accept that abundance mattered more than sophistication, that systems mattered more than individual brilliance, that being available mattered more than being flawless. Germany had built perfect aircraft, in insufficient numbers, with inadequate resources. Perfection lost the war. America had built good enough aircraft, in overwhelming numbers, with abundant resources. Good enough won the war. That was the lesson Marcus Schiller had learned, the lesson he'd tried to teach for 35 years. Not that perfection didn't matter, but that it mattered less than people thought. Less than abundance, less than availability, less than being exactly what was needed, exactly when it was needed. The Mustang had been that. Not perfect, but exactly right. Marcus Schiller fell asleep in his study that night, surrounded by drawings, surrounded by calculations, surrounded by evidence of a life spent trying to prove that engineering could serve something better than destruction. He'd proven it, once, with an aircraft that almost failed, that was rejected, that was vindicated only because someone else saw what it could be. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.